The lunch rush at Lark and Ledger was a storm in motion. Plates clattered against tabletops like cymbals in a chaotic orchestra. Servers darted between tables with trays stacked high, and a low hum of conversation swelled into an overwhelming roar. The smell of roasted garlic and seared steak bled into the air, mixing with the faint metallic scent of coins and cutlery. In the middle of it all moved Maya Thompson, a young black waitress with eyes that had learned to balance patience and exhaustion in equal measure. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, curls tucked under a simple black headband. Her navy apron tied snugly around her waist, the fabric faded from endless shifts and detergent cycles. To the untrained, she was just another member of staff, invisible in the blur of service. But today, Maya carried something heavier than trays. The chaos spiked when a tray slipped from another waiter's grip. A white plate shattered across the hardwood floor near Maya's feet, the porcelain exploding into shards that caught the light. Diners gasped, their laughter cracking into sudden silence. Maya bent instinctively to help gather the pieces, her hands moving with the practiced gentleness of someone used to cleaning up other people's messes. And as she crouched there, half hidden by a toppled napkin stand, she let slip a sound she hadn't meant to release. It was not a word, not even a hum, but a note. Low, precise, trembling at first, then steadier as the silence stretched. The melody grew without her meaning it to, carrying the kind of disciplined beauty that could not be mistaken for accident. A single phrase from a piece long buried in her chest surfaced into the crowded room like a pearl rising from the sea. At first it was fragile, a sigh between tasks, but it lingered in the air with a clarity that no diner could quite ignore. A few heads turned, curious. Someone at a corner table paused with a fork mid-bite. The note hung there, vibrating, refusing to vanish. And then, like a hawk spotting weakness, Victoria Dane descended. Victoria was the floor manager, tall, sharp-shouldered, and perpetually overdressed for a restaurant that still smelled faintly of fryer oil. Her blonde bob framed a face perpetually twisted in superiority, her lips always ready with a sneer. To staff, she was both feared and despised, a woman who saw the world as a ladder and every subordinate as a rung. "Excuse me," she snapped, voice pitched high enough to cut through the chatter. "What is this? Are we running an open mic now?" The room tittered nervously. Diners leaned closer. Maya froze, still kneeling, one shard of plate balanced in her palm. I said, Victoria continued, eyes narrowing, "Stop singing. No one came here for your little audition." The sarcasm dripped like venom. A table of young professionals, already half-buzzed on cocktails, laughed louder, emboldened by the manager's cruelty. Phones flicked up in an instant, screens glowing, recording, ready to turn humiliation into content. Maya rose slowly, setting the shard on the busboy's tray. Her posture straightened, calm, but unyielding. She didn't apologize. She didn't bow. She simply looked at Victoria with a stillness that carried weight. But Victoria wasn't done. Sensing an audience, she pushed further. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced theatrically, "meet our songbird who thinks the dining floor is her stage. Isn't she precious? Maybe she should sing for tips, since she can't seem to manage trays properly." Laughter rippled again. The sound was cruel, hollow. At table 7, near the window where city light poured across white linen, a man in a tailored gray suit froze mid-motion. He had lifted a fork, about to spear a piece of salmon, but now his hand hovered. His eyes had sharpened, locked on Maya, as though recognizing something the others could not hear. His face was unreadable, but the tremor in his hand betrayed something deeper, a memory stirring. Maya's gaze brushed past him, but did not linger. She stood with her chin lifted, eyes calm. She refused to feed the spectacle with shame. Victoria stepped closer, ripping the apron from Maya's waist with a practiced flourish. "You're fired," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Effective immediately. Consider this your last performance." The room buzzed with whispers. Diners leaned into one another, gossiping, already speculating about the video clips being uploaded in real time. A hashtag was probably being born that very second. Maya took the apron in her hands. She didn't clutch it like a lifeline, nor throw it back in anger. She folded it once, neatly, deliberately, as if it were a ritual. Her composure unnerved Victoria, who expected begging or tears. Silence stretched across the dining floor. Then Maya set her palm flat against the wooden host stand, her touch slow, reverent, almost like pressing her hand against a heartbeat. She looked not at Victoria, but at the crowd, at the diners who had laughed, at the phones pointed toward her, at the man whose fork still trembled. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. Some songs don't belong to you. The words struck with more force than a scream. They were not defensive, not pleading, simply stated, like a truth no one could contest. The diners shifted uncomfortably. Even the ones who laughed earlier now glanced at each other, sensing a weight they didn't understand. At table 7, the man's jaw clenched. He had heard those words before, spoken in another room by another voice. A memory flickered in his mind, as sharp and disorienting as a flash of lightning. Sheet music inked by hand, a recital program, his mother's handwriting. Victoria's smirk faltered, though she quickly masked it with a roll of her eyes. Oh, how poetic, she mocked. Save it for your next job, sweetheart. Maya turned then, not hurried, not shamed. She walked toward the door with each step measured. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to crumble, to falter. But she didn't. At the door, with her hand on the cool glass, she paused and turned back, her eyes cutting through the crowd like a blade. Play the ending, she said softly. The phrase hung in the air, cryptic, unsettling, like a prophecy. And then she was gone, leaving whispers, nervous laughter, and one billionaire diner staring after her with eyes that burned with recognition. Outside the glass doors of Lark and Ledger, the city pulsed on as if nothing had happened. Cabs honked, tourists ambled. A busker strummed his guitar across the street with a voice cracking from overuse. Maya stepped into the sunlight, blinking, apron folded under her arm like a relic of a former life. The humiliation still clung to her skin, the laughter of strangers echoing in her ears, but underneath it all beat another rhythm, quieter, steadier, older than shame. A melody that belonged to her alone. She walked 2 blocks, found the narrow alley where staff smoked between shifts, and sat on the cracked cement stoop. She slid her hand into her pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, corners fraying, seams threatening to burst. From its innermost fold, she drew a piece of paper, creased, yellowed, nearly translucent with time. It was a letter. The letter. The blue ink scrawl across the page had faded, but she knew every loop, every stroke. To my dear student, Maya Brooks, it began. This etude is yours. No one can take it. Play it until you own it. Eleanor Archer. Maya traced the name with her fingertip, her throat tightening. Eleanor Archer had been more than a teacher. She had been a force of nature wrapped in the modest frame of a public school music instructor, her chalk streak cardigans, her bun always falling loose, her eyes sparking when a student found the right note. Eleanor had discovered Maya when she was just 12, her voice raw but her ear uncanny. She listens once, Eleanor told the principal, and she returns it like stained glass returns sunlight, richer, transformed. That was how it began. Maya remembered the after-school lessons in a sunlit classroom that smelled of dust and wax polish, where Eleanor pressed her gently toward greatness. She remembered the first time she touched the etude, original, handwritten, designed for no one else. Not Mozart, not Schubert, not any dead composer whose works lined the shelves. This was Eleanor's own gift, a song meant only for her student to carry. Some songs don't belong to you, Eleanor had said with a rare softness. They belong to the ones who can bear them. For years, Maya bore it. She practiced on battered pianos, sang in cramped apartments, recorded herself on a borrowed tape deck. She clung to the promise of the Archer Fellowship, Eleanor's scholarship for gifted students whose families could not afford conservatories. The etude was her key, and Eleanor made her believe the door would open. But life had other plans. The summer before her senior year, Maya's grandmother suffered a stroke. Her stepfather's debts mounted, collectors knocking at the door like wolves. Nights that should have been filled with scales and rehearsals were spent at a diner counter, pouring coffee until dawn. When the orientation for the fellowship arrived, she wasn't there. She was in a hospital waiting room, clutching her grandmother's hand as monitors beeped in slow rhythm. The email reminders piled up. The phone rang unanswered. The opportunity slipped away, silently, brutally. By the time Maya resurfaced, the fellowship had gone to someone else. Eleanor left one final voicemail. Maya still had it saved. Maya, I hope you're safe. The etude is yours no matter what. Remember that. Then silence. Eleanor died 3 years later, long before Maya could find the courage to return. Her name disappeared from programs, from memory, from promise. She stopped being Maya Brooks, the prodigy. She became Maya Thompson, the caretaker, the provider, the woman who clocked into shifts and kept her head down. She learned that in certain rooms, singing drew ridicule, not respect, and so she buried the gift. But the etude never left her. It lived in her chest like a secret identity, a flame cupped in trembling hands. She sang it to herself on subway rides, hummed it while washing dishes, recorded fragments on her phone during the quiet hours between shifts. Always softly, always secretly. Now, sitting on the stoop, she pulled out her phone. With a thumb trembling less from anger than from anticipation, she scrolled through her files until she found it, a voice memo titled Midnight Etude 14. She pressed play. Her own voice spilled into the alley, richer than she remembered, layering over the city noise. It was imperfect, recorded after exhaustion, but the bones were there, the climb, the ache, the release. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the restaurant, the laughter, Victoria's sneer, all of it fell away. Instead, she was back in that classroom, Eleanor's hands conducting gently in the air, saying, yes, yes, there it is. That's the sound that saves. Maya pressed the phone to her chest, exhaling. Inside Larkin Ledger, the world still buzzed. Diners still posted their clips. Victoria was likely preening about her power. But at table 7 sat Daniel Archer, billionaire developer, Eleanor's son, the boy who once sat on the floor outside his mother's classroom, tracing cars in his sketchbook while she tutored her favorite student. He had heard the melody. He had heard her. And he was not done. Maya opened her eyes, folded the letter once more, and slipped it back into her wallet. She stood, the weight of humiliation transformed into something sharper, steadier. She straightened her shoulders, brushed the dust from her apron, and walked back toward the glass doors of the restaurant. Not as staff, not as a victim, but as a witness. Her hand pushed the door open, the dining room's chatter hitting her like a wave. Victoria glanced up from scolding another server, her smirk faltering when she saw Maya return. Diners looked too, curious. Maya didn't rush. She stepped to the center of the floor, drew her phone from her pocket, and held it steady in her hand. I'd like to play something, she said quietly, her voice calm. For the record. Her thumb hovered over the play button. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Maya felt the tide shift. The dining room had not yet recovered from the spectacle. Diners leaned over half-eaten plates, whispering, replaying clips on their phones. Victoria, satisfied with her public triumph, lingered near the hostess stand like a queen basking in victory. She didn't notice the tension simmering at table 7. The man in the gray suit, Daniel Archer, hadn't moved since Maya left, but the line she spoke still rang in his ears. Some songs don't belong to you. He knew those words. They weren't random. They weren't coincidence. His mother had said them once, in the quiet of their apartment above the elementary school, her voice heavy with something more than instruction. She'd whispered them when he was only a boy, when she'd first introduced him to a student she loved like family, Maya Brooks. And now here she was. When Maya re-entered, standing in the center of the dining floor with her phone in hand, Daniel's heart lurched. She was older, wearier, but there was no mistaking the poise, the quiet intensity that had once filled his mother's music room. The melody he'd heard, the truth in her eyes, it was all confirmation. Victoria was the first to break the moment. "Oh, for God's sake," she barked, rolling her eyes. "Didn't I fire you? Security will wait." Daniel's voice cut clean through the chatter. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. Heads turned instantly. Even Victoria flinched. Daniel rose from his seat, smoothing his suit jacket with deliberate calm. He pulled a crisp business card from his wallet and placed it flat on the linen tablecloth, as if planting a flag. He looked at Maya, his voice gentler now. "Would you allow me to hear that again?" The crowd shifted, murmurs rolling like wind through leaves. Phones lifted higher, recording not just a waitress anymore, but a man whose face they recognized from magazines, news profiles, billionaire real estate visionary lists. Victoria blinked, her confidence wavering. "Mr. Archer," she stammered, suddenly aware of who stood before her. Daniel ignored her. He kept his gaze on Maya, and in that gaze she saw not pity, but recognition. Encouragement. Maya's thumb pressed the play button. The etude spilled into the room, faint but unmistakable, her midnight recording, unpolished yet pure. Gasps dotted the dining floor. The melody threaded through the clatter of dishes, bending time, silencing laughter. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, lips moving as he traced each note. When the recording reached a certain phrase, a phrase only two people in the world should have known, he quietly hummed the next bar. Not just hummed. He knew it, every rise and fall, every breath his mother had inscribed into the piece. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. "My mother wrote that," he said. His voice cracked slightly, but it carried across the room. "She wrote it for one student. For you." The restaurant froze. Victoria sputtered. "What?" "This is ridiculous." But Maya reached in her bag and pulled out something far older than her phone, a faded program from a spring recital years ago. The paper was curled at the edges, the ink fading, but the name Maya Brooks was still visible, and across the margin, in looping script, was Eleanor Archer's signature. She held it up for all to see. Gasps rippled again. Diners leaned closer, whispering, piecing together a story they had never expected to witness. Maya's voice didn't tremble. She spoke not to Victoria, but to everyone present. Work feeds bodies. Music feeds souls. Neither should cost you dignity. Her words rang like a gavel, steady, final. Victoria laughed nervously, waving her hand. "What? We're supposed to believe this? A scrap of paper and a song. Hardly proof." Daniel turned, fixing Victoria with a gaze that stripped her veneer of power. "It's more proof than your cruelty will ever justify." He gestured to the room. "You turned humiliation into theater. But do you know what you've done? You've mocked the very gift my mother devoted her life to nurturing. And you've mocked the student she never stopped mourning." The crowd shifted uneasily. Diners who had laughed earlier now looked at their plates, ashamed. Servers watched from the kitchen door, hope flickering in their eyes. Victoria's smirk faltered, but she forced a shrug. "We all have rules." She broke them. "Rules?" Maya said softly, tilting her head. Her eyes were calm, but her voice carried a sharpness that sliced through the air. "There's a rule older than yours. Respect. You broke that the moment you turned my voice into a punchline." Silence followed, and then Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled swiftly, found what he was looking for, and handed it to Maya. On the screen glowed an email chain. His mother's fellowship committee, Eleanor herself writing about our most promising student, about Maya's gift, about her dream of seeing her at conservatory. The last email in the thread, never answered. "Are you safe? Please let me know." Maya's chest tightened as she read it, her fingers trembling. She remembered that night. She remembered her grandmother's pale face under hospital lights. And she remembered the phone she never had the courage to pick up. She looked at Daniel. For the first time, there was no wall between them, just shared memory, shared loss, and the music that connected them still. Victoria opened her mouth to object again, but the diners weren't on her side anymore. A murmur swelled through the room, low but unmistakable. Sympathy for Maya, anger at the cruelty they had witnessed, curiosity at the story unfolding. The tide was turning. Daniel nodded toward the program in Maya's hand. If you would, he said quietly. She understood. She turned on her phone recorder again and lifted the recital program for all to see. This is my truth, she said. And if you doubt it, there's more. Much more. The crowd leaned in. Cameras zoomed closer. Victoria paled, sensing her grip slipping. And then Maya looked directly at her. Calm, unshaken. The first piece of evidence is ready. The room held its breath. The air in Lark and Ledger thickened, heavy with the weight of silence. Diners who had moments before laughed at Maya now sat frozen, eyes darting between her, the faded recital program, and the billionaire standing at her side. Phones hovered midair, live streams buzzing with comments that scrolled faster than the eye could read. Daniel Archer straightened, his presence commanding without effort. He gestured for Maya to continue, and together they stood in the center of the restaurant floor, no longer waitress and customer, but witness and ally. Victoria tried to rally. Her smile was brittle, her tone sharp. This is getting absurd. A dusty program and a lullaby? None of this proves she belongs here. She was disruptive. She broke policy. End of story. But Maya didn't flinch. She unlocked her phone again, scrolling with sure fingers until she found it. A voicemail saved for years, hidden like a sacred relic. She tapped play, and Eleanor Archer's voice, grainy with age but still vibrant, filled the dining room. Maya, the etude is yours. No one can take that. Promise me you'll keep it alive. The sound was haunting. Diners turned wide-eyed, some covering their mouths, others whispering in disbelief. The intimacy of the message pierced through the clinking of glasses, through the mutters of doubt. Eleanor's tone carried love, certainty, and a name spoken tenderly. She kept that. Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. His jaw tightened. My mother kept asking about you. She thought she'd failed you. Maya's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. She didn't fail me. Life got in the way, but I never stopped carrying what she gave me. The room stirred. A diner at the bar suddenly raised his phone. Wait, look at this, he said. He had pulled up a local alumni page, an old newspaper clipping archived online. It showed Eleanor standing beside a young black girl at a school recital, her hand on the girl's shoulder. The caption read, Prodigy Maya Brooks debuts original etude, written for her by music teacher Eleanor Archer. Gasps spread across the floor. Daniel moved swiftly now. He opened his own email archive, scrolling until he found what he'd shown Maya earlier. With a flick, he airdropped the chain to the hostess's iPad. She hesitated, but he gestured firmly, and soon the emails glowed on the screen behind the desk, visible to anyone who wanted to look. Scholarship award, he read aloud, voice steady. Orientation date, and the unanswered message my mother sent after Maya disappeared. Are you safe? Please let me know. The words hit like a hammer. Diners shifted from curiosity to outrage, their whispers turning into condemnation. Victoria's face flushed red. This is all irrelevant. The rule book is clear. Employees are not permitted to. A young server, emboldened, stepped out from the kitchen doorway. He pulled out his phone, fumbling nervously, and opened a thread of texts. His voice trembled as he read aloud. Look at this. She wrote, these staff think they're divas. I'll make an example out of one today. That was this morning. She was talking about Maya. Gasps turned into murmurs of anger. Diners craned their necks to read the screen as the young man held it up. More servers peeked out, nodding silently, their faces pale but determined. This isn't about policy, Maya said, her voice firm. It's about cruelty, about power used to humiliate instead of protect. You don't strip dignity from someone just because you can. Phones recorded every syllable. Somewhere online, the hashtag was already forming. Victoria tried again, but her voice cracked this time. She's just a waitress. You're all being manipulated by truth. Daniel cut her off. His voice was sharper now, honed with fury. You mistake humility for weakness. And you mistake humiliation for authority. My mother believed in this woman, and so do I. The crowd, once passive, now leaned forward as one, the way an audience leans at the climax of a play. Their faces were no longer amused but transfixed, their eyes reflecting something raw: shame, awe, recognition. Maya took a step closer to Victoria. Not aggressive, not taunting, simply closing the distance. Her voice dropped, quiet enough that the silence had to bend around it. "You wanted to make an example of me. Fine. Here it is." She lifted her phone once more. "You've seen paper. You've heard voices. But this is only the first verse." The diners murmured. Someone whispered, "First verse?" Another leaned closer. "What else does she have?" Maya's gaze swept the room, her calm composure belying the storm in her chest. "This isn't revenge," she said slowly. "It's exposure. And if you think this is all there is, wait until you hear the chorus." The line landed like thunder. Diners erupted into whispers. Phones surged closer. The live stream comments exploded with fire emojis and exclamation marks. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed, her voice swallowed by the shifting tide. For the first time that day, the balance of power tilted. The laughter that had crushed Maya minutes ago was gone. In its place was something heavier, sharper, an expectant hush waiting for the next revelation. And Maya, standing in the middle of the floor with nothing but her truth, held that hush like a conductor raising her baton. She inhaled slowly. "There's something else you need to hear." The dining room of Lark and Ledger had transformed. What was once the stage of Maya's humiliation now felt like an expectant theater, the crowd leaning in, phones raised, breath suspended. The whispers that had mocked her only minutes ago were now whispers of awe, threads of anticipation winding tighter with every passing second. Maya stood tall at the center of it all, her folded recital program in one hand, her phone in the other. The power had shifted, but she knew she had to seal it, not with arguments or faded papers, but with something undeniable. Something no rulebook, no sneer, no corporate jargon could refute. Daniel Archer seemed to sense it too. He walked toward the lounge at the edge of the dining floor, where a pianist hired for ambience played light, standards for brunch. The man froze mid-chord as Daniel leaned down, whispered, then gestured for him to step aside. The pianist obeyed without question, sliding off the bench. Gasps erupted as Daniel sat in his place. To see a billionaire in a tailored suit lowering himself onto a restaurant piano was shocking enough. But to see him nod toward Maya, inviting her forward, carried the weight of something cinematic, larger than the room itself. "Play it," Daniel said softly. Maya hesitated, eyes darting around the sea of diners. Every phone was pointed at her, the glow of their screens like hundreds of spotlights. Fear whispered at her ribs, but so did the etude, steady, pulsing alive. She walked toward the piano, each step a reclamation. She set the program gently atop the instrument and nodded. Daniel's hands hovered, waiting, and then, with a breath, she began. Her voice slipped into the room like dawn breaking. Low, clear, disciplined. She carried the opening measures with precision, her tone weaving with Daniel's chords as he played what he remembered from years of listening to his mother hum the same lines. Together, they rebuilt the piece, measure by measure, as if resurrecting something long buried. The melody swelled, not as background noise, but as declaration. It rose above the clink of silverware, above the hum of the city outside, and poured into every corner of the restaurant. Diners who had once mocked now stood transfixed, tears brimming in some eyes, hands pressed to their chests. Servers crowded the doorway, their aprons still dusted with flour, their eyes wide with wonder. It was not a performance. It was testimony. Every note Maya sang carried years of hunger, nights of exhaustion, mornings of silence endured. It carried Eleanor's faith, the letter folded in her wallet, the promise that had refused to die. And when the etude climbed to its peak, Maya did not falter. She soared. Phones shook as hands trembled. Streams erupted with comments. "This is unreal. She's incredible. How could they fire her?" Mid-phrase, Daniel stopped playing. He turned, deliberately, toward the general manager who had rushed in, phone pressed to his ear, corporate headquarters no doubt demanding an explanation. "I'll make this simple," Daniel said, his voice steady even as Maya's notes rang over him. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, setting it atop the piano. As of this afternoon, I am acquiring a controlling interest in Lark and Ledger's parent group. The papers are signed. Gasps rippled. Forks clattered. The general manager's mouth dropped open. Daniel continued. And let me be clear, we are not in the business of shaming people for being human. Not anymore. He opened the folder, revealing HR complaints, turnover statistics, even texts forwarded by staff. Evidence of systemic cruelty, of Victoria's reign of humiliation. The GM looked at the papers, then at Victoria, his face pale. Victoria staggered backward. This is insane. You can't. This isn't. But her voice was drowned out by the surge of applause as Maya climbed into the final passage of the etude, her voice cutting through the chaos with crystalline force. The sound was electric. It was defiance turned into art, pain turned into beauty. It was a note no rule book could silence, no policy could erase. When the final phrase came, Maya delivered it not as plea but as benediction. She held the note, let it bloom, then let it fall gently, reverently like a blessing. The room erupted, diners rising to their feet, clapping, cheering, some shouting her name as if they had known it all along. The applause shook the walls, but Maya's eyes were on Victoria. Calm, unwavering, she walked toward her with the stillness of someone who had already won. Victoria's bravado collapsed, her lips trembling as she scrambled for words. This can't. Maya stopped in front of her, close enough that the phones caught every detail, the sweat beating on Victoria's temple, the tremor in her hands. This is not revenge, Maya said, her voice quiet but sharp as glass. This is just the beginning. The crowd roared again, but Maya didn't bask in it. She simply turned back toward the piano, laid her hand atop the recital program, and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The applause at Lark and Ledger did not end when Maya left the floor. It spilled into the street, into timelines, into the endless current of digital chatter that shapes reputations in minutes. By the time she awoke the next morning, blurry-eyed in her small apartment above a laundromat, the clip had been seen millions of times. The hashtags pulsed across platforms. Hashtag songs belong to us. Hashtag the etude. Hashtag waitress no more. But virality alone was not enough. Maya had seen too many moments flare and vanish, leaving no warmth behind. She wanted something lasting, something Eleanor would recognize as more than spectacle. Daniel understood. Within days, he summoned a press conference, sleek, formal, held not in a glass tower, but in a community art center where Eleanor once taught. Maya stood beside him, nervous in a second-hand blazer, the recital program tucked like an amulet into her bag. Cameras flashed, journalists murmured. Daniel cleared his throat. My mother believed that art is not a luxury, he said. It is survival. Last week the world rediscovered the student she never forgot. Today, together, we are making sure no student is ever forgotten again. He gestured to Maya. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady as she announced the Eleanor Archer Fellowship for working-class artists. The fellowship would cover not just tuition, but also the hidden costs that once crushed her dream. Subway passes, caregiving stipends, lost wages for missed shifts. Talent, she said into the microphones, shouldn't be buried under debt or silence. It should breathe. The words echoed across headlines. Donations poured in. Within weeks, the fund swelled beyond their initial projections. Meanwhile, Lark and Ledger underwent its own transformation. Under Daniel's new control, policies changed overnight. Employees received dignity shift protections, guaranteed paid breaks, de-escalation training to handle stress without cruelty, and a humanity clause that allowed staff to nurture their creative identities. The staff who once whispered in fear now laughed openly in the break room. The kitchen filled with music between orders, spatulas drumming on counters, someone humming without dread of reprimand. The first community concert happened one Sunday morning before brunch service. The restaurant was rearranged, its tables pushed aside, folding chairs lined in rows, sheet pans stacked like cymbals in the back. Sunlight poured through the front windows. Maya stood at the piano, her curls loose for the first time in months, watching as children filed in clutching violins, clarinets, even battered recorders. Diners who had once been strangers now sat side by side, their chatter softer, reverent. When she sang the etude that day, it was no longer hers alone. The room sang with her, voices weaving into something communal, something healing. Days later she returned to the district where Eleanor once tuned cheap school pianos by ear. The hallways smelled the same, wax and dust, sweat and chalk. Maya led her first master class there, teaching nervous teenagers who carried instruments like fragile secrets. She showed them the letter Eleanor had written her, the same creased page she once clung to in despair. Your talent is real, she told them. Your circumstances don't erase it. This etude is proof. Victoria, meanwhile, launched her appeal. She sent frantic emails, scheduled meetings, pleaded that her termination was unjust. But the HR board found no audience. Screenshots of her texts had already spread. Her name appeared in think pieces about toxic authority and the theater of humiliation. Eventually, she retreated to LinkedIn, where she recast her history in vague euphemism, transitioned out of management to pursue new opportunities. Few believed it, and fewer cared. The movement outside the restaurant only grew. The viral clip became more than a story. It became a symbol. Workers in coffee shops, warehouses, hospitals, even rideshares used the tag #SongsBelongToUs to share their own moments of hidden artistry. A nurse sketching between shifts, a janitor playing violin in an empty hall, a cashier reciting poetry in the break room. The hashtag became, in its small way, a civilizing force in workplaces built on speed and silence. At the second concert, the restaurant was packed. The tables were once again pushed aside, but this time the crowd spilled out onto the sidewalk, people craning their necks to glimpse the makeshift stage. Maya stood beside a boy of no more than 12, his hands trembling around a violin bow. He raised the instrument, swallowed hard, and began to play the etude. The first note squeaked but then steadied. The room hushed, holding its breath as the child carried the melody across the floor. He didn't drop a single note. When the last measure faded, the applause shook the windows. Maya knelt beside him, cupping his shoulder, whispering, "You did it." His smile cracked wide, tears streaming down his face as the crowd cheered his name. That evening, Daniel approached her with a small velvet case. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said. Inside lay Eleanor's fountain pen, the one she had used to write notes on margins and programs, its nib still stained faintly with blue ink. Maya's hands trembled as she lifted it. The weight was delicate but symbolic. With that pen, she signed the first scholarship certificate of the fellowship. Her name scrolled across the paper with Eleanor's ghost beside it, her spirit alive in every stroke. When she looked up, the room was not just applauding, it was believing. Believing in art, in justice, in beginnings multiplied. And for the first time, Maya realized she was no longer singing solo. She was conducting a movement. A year later, the hum of a city morning drifted through the open windows of a rehearsal space perched above a laundromat. The faint scent of detergent and lavender wafted up the stairwell, mixing with the brighter smell of resin and sheet music. On the second floor, a hand-painted sign read, "The Eleanor Archer Fellowship, Studio 1." Inside, the space was alive with sound. Rows of mismatched chairs circled the room. Posters lined the walls. Neighborhood recital. Service industry showcase. Night shift choir. They weren't glossy conservatory flyers. They were handmade, colored with markers, and printed on donated paper. But they were beautiful in their imperfection, and each one told the story of voices finally given room to grow. At the piano sat Maya Thompson, no longer a waitress, no longer the girl mocked for daring to sing. Today she was a teacher, a mentor, and a recording artist whose small EP, titled Secret Identity, had quietly sold out its first pressing. Her curls framed her face, looser now, her eyes shining with something that had taken years to reclaim: peace. Across from her sat Daniel Archer, suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, his hair threaded with more silver than last year. He had never tried to play the billionaire savior. Instead, he arrived with boxes of folding chairs, with donations tucked in envelopes, with the humility of a son honoring his mother's unfinished work. Together, they had turned a moment of public humiliation into a living movement. The fellowship now supported 50 students from across the city, dishwashers, cashiers, single parents, night shift security guards. They came clutching guitars, flutes, sketchbooks, even dance shoes, their eyes carrying the same nervous spark Maya once had when Eleanor first told her she mattered. In the far corner of the studio hung a single framed page, Eleanor's letter to Maya, edges yellowed, ink faded, but still legible. Every student who walked into the space touched the glass for luck. Meanwhile, the old world carried on. Larkin Ledger, reformed under Daniel's ownership, became known not only for its cuisine, but also for its Sunday concerts. Tourists lined up for brunch, not just to eat, but to witness the art that bloomed where cruelty once reigned. Employees stayed longer, turnover plummeted, and the workplace buzzed with an energy built on respect. The restaurant that once mocked a voice now amplified dozens. Victoria, Dane's name, surfaced occasionally, stripped of its sharp edges, dulled by time. She found work here and there, each stint shorter than the last. Eventually her career drifted into irrelevance, her name appearing only in cautionary HR slideshows about leadership gone wrong. People stopped whispering her name with fear. They remembered it only with pity. But Maya never wasted thought on Victoria. She had long since learned that revenge burns out quickly. Justice, by contrast, builds. And what she and Daniel built had outlasted every viral cycle, every gossip headline. On this particular afternoon, a young boy with anxious eyes stepped to the front of the room. His violin shook in his hands. "I don't think I can do it," he whispered. Maya knelt so her eyes met his. "Do you know the first note?" He nodded timidly. "Then you already can," she said. He placed bowed a string. The opening notes of the etude wavered, fragile but alive. The fellowship students leaned in, holding their breath as he climbed through the melody. When he reached the end, his bow hands steadied. He smiled, wide and disbelieving, as the room erupted in applause. Maya rose, her own eyes wet. She reached into her bag and drew out Eleanor's fountain pen, the same pen Daniel had returned to her months ago. She uncapped it, the nib still carrying faint stains of ink, and signed the certificate that bore the boy's name. She handed it to him, and his fingers closed around it as though it were gold. In that moment, she realized something profound. The etude was no longer hers alone. It had become a language passed from one student to another, each adding their own grace notes, each carrying it forward. When the applause quieted, Maya turned to the group. Phones recorded as always, live streams flickering to friends and strangers around the world. She placed the pen back in its case and spoke, her voice steady, resonant. "The world will try to rename you," she said. "It will call you unworthy, replaceable, invisible. But your voice, your art, that is the name you choose. Carry it, protect it, and when someone tries to take it from you, remember, songs don't belong to them. They belong to you." The room erupted again. Hashtags bloomed online before the last echo faded. Parents watching the stream from across the city left comments of thanks. Former students messaged memories of Eleanor, and strangers wrote of how one waitress had reminded them to stop burying their own gifts. Maya smiled at the cameras. "Tell me your story below, and subscribe because this movement isn't finished. It's only beginning." The live stream hearts floated across the screen, a digital ovation. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. For once, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight alone. Together they looked out across the rehearsal room, students laughing, instruments tuning, futures unfolding. It wasn't revenge that had brought them here. It wasn't even the viral clip. It was legacy. Eleanor's legacy, now theirs to tend. Maya exhaled, her eyes closing briefly as if listening for a sound only she could hear. It was there, the etude, eternal, passed from teacher to student, mother to son, mentor to child. A name carried in song.